Of the handful of pieces of content I created about Ukraine over the years, this one, 9 Lessons of Russian Propaganda, was by far the most impactful with over 30,000 Twitter impressions. In a way, I think it's a lot less important now than it was then, because now, with Russia's catastrophic miscalculation, the cat is out of the bag, and people see, more or less, see the lies for what they are. In 2014, it really felt like their propaganda was winning, and so I think this article did its small part to combat that. Nevertheless, though it's less important today, I think it still may be useful in understanding the information space. So I present to you a video version of my 2016 essay, 9 Lessons of Russian Propaganda. Most of the examples used in the essay are not in the video, and most of the examples used in the video are not in the essay. I just keep the categories the same. So if this topic interests you, check out the essay as well. Number 1, rely on dissenting political groups to disseminate your talking points. This is a picture of Yuri Bezmenov, who was a very high-level KGB operative who defected in 1984. He's best known for an interview that usually appears under the title "Deception Was My Job." And usually this interview is sort of positioned as a predictor of the cultural tension in the United States. But, and whether it is that or not, if you're interested in Russian propaganda, you must listen to this with an ear to the fact that the KGB is the successor to all of Russia's intelligence agencies. Okay, I don't think that's a controversial statement. Same people, same bureaucracies, same methodology. And the important point that he makes is that 85% of the KGB's resources did not go to like espionage or that types of like a fancy James Bond stuff, but towards ideological work, towards getting talking points out there. And a huge part of that was influencing the media in target countries, specifically infiltrating groups and specifically promoting the people who you need to promote. Now, it's true that maybe the Soviet Union was a little bit more ideologically minded because they were promoting Russian imperialism together with communism, which was a global movement. But nevertheless, like you can't think that Russia didn't inherit a lot from its Soviet times. It inherited nearly everything. So, and as an illustration towards the insane levels that Russia would go to get its talking points out there, Yuri himself was dispatched to the United States not to infiltrate some protests that were underway, not to infiltrate some political group, although I'm sure those things were being worked on too, but to infiltrate the Transcendental Meditation Movement, a completely apolitical organization, because Russia thought that it promoted a sort of detached navel gazing that might be useful to weakening America. So if they're willing to go that far, you better believe that in organizations that are expressly political or expressly, engaging in agitation or promotion, that Russian intelligence is aware of those and involved with those. So I first encountered that in the libertarian / like anti-war community, which I had a leg in the mid-aughts and in 2014 when the first invasion of Ukraine happened, and I wrote these series of essays, just horrified at what was being said in libertarian channels and at how I was received when I very sort of innocently and good-naturedly tried to correct some of the talking points. Aside from the libertarian press, in the dissident right, that constellation of people and organizations that might be called the dissident right, they fly Russian flags. Like it's absolutely ridiculous. Russian flags, Z symbol, they're basically cheerlead genocide. But it's not just the right, as many people think it is. They think, oh, we're the right, Russia's aligned with us because they're also a traditionalist country. No. This is a picture of John Parker. He was the United States Communist Party candidate for president in 2004, and he showed his face in Luhansk a few months ago, singing the praises of the Kremlin. This here was a demonstration, also about a month ago in Chicago. Some communist organization just held this ridiculous LARPy rally with communist flags, showing the Z symbol celebrating Russia's invasion of Ukraine and flying the flag of Russia's puppet People's Republic. And this one is also very interesting. This was all the way back in 2014. There was an LGBTQ rally in New York against Ukraine in support of Russia's invasion. And this lady on the right is carrying a sign, "There is no pride in supporting Kyiv fascists, solidarity with resistance in Ukraine." And it has the the purple upside down triangle together with the flags of the Donetsk People's Republic and the St. George ribbon of Russia's invasion. In several places, Kremlin ideologues, among them Alexander Dugin, whose influence may be a bit exaggerated, though that's a different topic, but nevertheless it provides useful insight. He calls for the unification of pretty much any ideology. I mean, he says it as explicitly as it could be said. It doesn't matter what you believe, as long as you oppose America. And I think the evidence for them acting on this strategy is overwhelming. Number 2, domestic propaganda is most important. Now, it has been observed that domestic propaganda is always more important, but Russia has a unique paranoia and fragility that other countries do not. Hopefully, I'll have the time to make another video, and I will argue that Russia evolved from a country that was deathly afraid of annihilation at the hands of the Mongolian hordes to a nation that was deathly afraid that their social order, which took a lot of things from the Mongolians, was inferior. And they're right, it is. But for that reason, they are very scared of contact with the outside, and they always need to be convincing their population that they're still strong. I'll cite 2 quotes for this to bolster this point of view. But Marquis de Custine, a French visitor who came to Russia about 200 years ago, he said that Russia would not survive 20 years of open contact with the West. Second observation along these lines comes from Shane O'Rourke, who wrote a brilliant history of the Cossacks. And he's talked about how Cossack society was an alternative to Russian feudalism, and the Cossacks demonstrated to those masses that an alternative viable social order did indeed exist. This was to prove far more threatening to Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy and the Russian Empire than the Cossack swords and muskets on their own could ever be. So Russia targets its domestic propaganda in a way that's much stronger, I think, than other countries do. They need to always be sort of positioning what they do. When they're defeated by Ukrainian forces, they need to say no, we're fighting NATO forces. There are NATO generals in Azovstal, leading the defense of Mariupol. And they always need to be controlling things and reassuring them that, yes, we are strong. One of the most absurd examples of this came not from Putin, but from his puppet dictator Lukashenko, who told his domestic audience that people from Lithuania and Poland were lined up at the Belarusian border trying to get salt and buckwheat porridge because they had none, because Lithuania and Poland were so poor. Number 3, destroy and ridicule the idea of truth. This is closely related to polluting the information space, which I'll talk about later. But the examples here are many, and they are very glaring. And these also make me very angry that someone could just get away, or an institution or civilization can get away with just such consistent lies. But here are some egregious examples. So after the war crimes in Bucha, the Russian envoy to the UN quotes a Bucha survivor saying that Russians came and said they were bringing groceries. And then the Russian envoy stopped. And I watched this interview. You can find it online. But what the Russian envoy left out was that the next line of the statement was, and then they threw a hand grenade into the cellar. And they like specifically chose that example because it's sort of mocking. This is not lying to convince you. This is lying to scare you, to intimidate you, and just to kind of make you give up on trying to understand what's really happening. And it's nice to see that they're failing. Here's another example. This was from the some official inspection of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and the representative of the Russian side is explaining to them that a missile, which really, really looks, I guess it was a dud missile buried in the ground, he's explaining that it really, really looks like it came from the Russian side, but it actually landed and then turned 180 degrees, or else turned in the air and then landed. I'm not sure what he's saying. Another glaring example came on the heels of the 2014 invasion. Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, this isn't some low-level propagandist. This is foreign minister, one of the highest offices in the country. He said, like, everyone was asking, why have you violated the Budapest Memorandum? It's like a page-and-a-half agreement where Ukraine gave up all its nuclear weapons in the mid-90s in exchange for Russia honoring it, saying that it would honor Ukraine's sovereignty and borders. And Lavrov made a bold-faced lie, as bold as could be. He said, no, we didn't violate it. It only contains one condition, and that is that Russia does not conduct a nuclear war against Ukraine. So invading's okay, nuclear war is not. This is outrageously untrue, and you wouldn't expect anybody to believe this, but he says it anyway as a way of sort of demonstrating their unpredictability, or demonstrating that they're untethered even by the most obvious basic facts. Similar statements came from Lavrov. We're not planning to attack other countries, and we didn't attack Ukraine. He said that after the invasion was already underway. And of course, you can add to that all the betrayals of treaties, like in Ilovaisk in the 2014 invasion. They negotiated the evacuation of Ukrainians who were partly surrounded, and then they massacred them. They came to an agreement on grain shipments, and then the next day they bomb a port in Odessa, Ukraine's main port for exporting grain of those that are left. In Syria, they announced the ceasefire, and then immediately later they bombed, I think, 5 hospitals in one day, right after announcing a ceasefire. So these are not lies to convince you. These are lies that demonstrate that they are unpredictable and untethered. These are lies that attempt to intimidate you. Number 4, Putin is strong and Russia is strong. I will not illustrate this with too many examples. I think it's obvious at this point. But I will add that being strong is the sine qua non of Russian civilization. It is the thing without which there is nothing. I believe they inherited this mentality from the Mongols, or maybe as a survival mechanism against the Mongols. And I hope to elaborate on that in a future video. Number 5, headlines are more important than reality. So recently we saw a devastating, from the Russian point of view, devastating retreat from Kharkiv Oblast. Thousands of soldiers lost, hundreds or maybe more pieces of equipment lost, huge swaths of lands liberated by the Ukrainians. So immediately they need to attack Ukraine's power grid and make all their propaganda agents all over alternative media start chattering about how it's a success that Russia knocked out Ukrainians' power grid so easily. Here's another example all the way back from 2014 or 15. Russia announced the wrong winner of a Ukrainian election. They announced that the far-right candidate won an election when he received less than 2% of the vote. And this is just to affect people's perceptions, like people especially who are a little bit further removed from the events will just have their biases confirmed or created, and then they'll forget about it and not look into it. And then when they hear the next day that somebody else won, they'll think it was some other election. But that emotion, I think, will stay, or at least I think that's the doctrine behind this sort of bizarre like work to push fake headlines right when something happens. So number 6, demoralize. Russia uses fear and intimidation to really try to undermine an enemy. They use fear and intimidation to run their own society, as has been observed for many centuries. So you sure as hell bet that they're going to use it against enemies as well. They do not want a world in which everybody knows for sure that, for example, Russia does not create war crimes, that they do not use chemical weapons, that they do not commit atrocities. That's not the world they want. They want the world in which they do those things, and people are afraid of having those things done to them, and yet people in the West will say, no, it's fake, they're not doing it. They need that kind of dissonance. That's the type of environment in which they thrive. But some examples of this, when Russia took over Crimea, they kidnapped a local activist named Reshat Ametov. He was a Tartar, and he was pro-Ukrainian. And against the secession, and his body was discovered tortured. They did the same thing with a local pro-Ukrainian politician, Volodymyr Rybak, and then they allowed the bodies to be discovered, which had been mutilated horribly, and that intimidates and puts opposition underground. There was that short-lived headline of a chemical attack in Azovstal, which the leaders of the Azov battalion said had only weak effects on 3 soldiers, and they weren't sure what it was, nor could they figure it out. Notably, the day before that, some representative from Russia's puppet government in Donetsk talked about chemical weapon attacks. So they're creating this illusion like chemical attacks might happen. We'll probably never know if it was real or not. But yeah, demoralization and intimidation is a huge part of what they do. Their talking points are always going on about how weak Ukraine is and how horrible it is and how corrupt it is, trying to undermine Western support, which largely succeeded in 2014 and largely failed in 2022. Oh, and by the way, it's in their freaking doctrine. So this is a screenshot from a wonderful video by Perun, who creates some of the best Ukraine content. And in that box is a translation of Russian doctrine, and it reads, attack the most vulnerable parts of the enemy's combat systems. This includes strikes on the infrastructure and even civilian targets. Such attacks will be coordinated with perception management efforts to convey the view that these terror tactics are no worse than enemy bombing campaigns. So it is in their doctrine. Like, I could not imagine finding this in NATO doctrine or in Western militaries. We just don't think that way. One of the reasons I was surprised by the invasion and really pessimistic about Ukraine's future and prospects for independence before the invasion was that the Russians are just so good at demoralization and making their conquest and influence seem inevitable. And amazingly, the wonderful YouTube commentator and brave soldier Operator Starsky said the same thing. He said he was very pessimistic about Ukraine's chances before the war started. So demoralization is a huge tool in the kit of the Russians. They inherited it from the Soviet Union, and I think they need it because they're trying to be a superpower with an economy that is only slightly bigger than Florida's. Who knows? Maybe after the sanctions, it's even smaller than Florida's. So their investment in propaganda is really a power multiplier. Number 7, move the conversation. Russian propaganda is very professional. It's created by smart people. That's not to say it doesn't follow like some ridiculous strategies like the firehouse of falsehoods where they just say everything and see what sticks to the wall. But it's professional and relentless. So you'll never get like an apology if you do a lot of work to prove them wrong. Like they'll always just grasp at one more straw or look for some moral equivalence or just distract. For example, for a while we stopped talking about massacres in Bucha. We stopped talking about Mariupol, where it seems today that more people died than in the bombing of Hiroshima. And instead, we're talking about like more trivial things, like whether it was appropriate for Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to appear on the cover of Vogue. It's relentless and it never stops, which is why it's important to understand it. Number 8, pollute the information space. This is the most bizarre and interesting of all the points. And a lot of it was summarized in this short 2014 documentary called Wipe about Vladislav Surkov. So Russia had an internet problem. 10 years ago, the majority of Russians were still not on the internet. And what were they going to do? Because they do have that paranoia that I mentioned earlier, that paranoia that French writer Marquis de Custine speculated about, that Russia would not survive 20 years contact with the West. And their strategy, both domestically and internationally, seems to be to just pollute the information space. So this short documentary called Wipe talks about a Vladislav Surkov strategy. He was a Putin or Kremlin agent, or I don't know what his position was, but he supported everybody in Russia. He supported groups that were against each other. Completely, he supported communists, he supported fascists, he supported absolutely everybody. And what's more, he said he was doing so. So you had, like, the opposition just couldn't get any legs because suddenly it was, oh, you're not real opposition, you're just supported by this political project. It's really fascinating stuff. There was a book written about modern Russia also around 2014 called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, The Surreal Heart of Modern Russia. And that's what their propaganda seems to strive for. They don't like how reality looks. It is that Russian paranoia that they have an inferior system, which they seem to, and they just need to kind of like obliterate truth, obliterate people's capacity of understanding. A problem with this, and I've heard this from Russian sources, is that they're good at destroying belief in something. They're good at sort of like turning off movements which might come to challenge the Kremlin, but they're not good at creating movements. So they're not good at mobilizing soldiers, at getting people to go support a cause. They only have the negative side of it. They're only good at discouraging. The firehouse of falsehood strategy, which I mentioned earlier, is a big part of polluting the information space. And there are myriad examples that are just so bizarre and fascinating. So there's from 2014, there's the Columbia Chemicals plant explosion hoax, which was supposedly a terrorist attack against the chemicals factory in Louisiana. And it even made it onto the local news. And it was carried out by the Taliban, I think, or ISIS, and it was all fake. The whole thing from top to bottom was made up, but it was so powerful that it made it onto local news. And there was an extensive article about it in the New York Times Magazine, pointing towards Russian disinformation. I don't think that's conclusively proven, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting it. Another example of this, which I found distressing, was made it onto Revolver News, which has been horrible regarding Russian propaganda. And I found that distressing because Revolver News was recommended and promoted by Trump advisor Steve Bannon, so it reaches up to really high levels. And they published this absolutely bizarre story on in early March, suggesting that there was no war in Ukraine at all. There was no war whatsoever. And apparently some British guy, although we can't prove it's British, I think it's all anonymous, like he flew to Ukraine and he made all these B-roll videos of some places that I know, like the train station in Lviv. or just the street scene in Lviv and from other places, just claiming that there were Hollywood sets all over the place. As evidence of Hollywood sets, he just recorded, news broadcasts and said, "Look, they're staging things." And he traveled all over Ukraine and said there was no war going on at all. And he took like B-roll footage of just streets and train stations as evidence that there's no war going on. This was absolutely bizarre. This was at a time when, I had friends hiding in bomb shelters. I had friends evacuating because their towns were getting bombed. And here some idiot just goes through a lot of effort, apparently, to shoot B-roll footage all over Ukraine and claim that there is no war whatsoever. Around this same time, like claiming that there is no war whatsoever seemed to be like a thing in Russian propaganda at this time, as it was upon the invasion in 2014. I also found this crazy video where they seem to have staged the staging of a war. So you can look at this video for yourself, and they seem to be, they have people applying makeup to an actor who's in the costume of a soldier. And again, that they promoted this in early March as evidence that there was no invasion whatsoever. This was largely a repeat of what happened in 2014 when it succeeded. I would say this time around it failed. In 2014, Russia also invaded, and Ukrainians attempted to get some kind of outcry, and official statements at least about Russia's invasion, but found themselves in the very ridiculous and frustrating position of having to prove that the invasion was even happening in the face of the most ridiculous, absurd, and flagrant disinformation. And here you can imagine, as in many places, that sarcastic smile of Peskov or Yuri Bezmenov or any other Kremlin operative just hanging over that tragedy. And one last note about polluting the information space. In the 2014 reporting, or the 2015 reporting, the report came a year later, about the Columbia Chemicals hoax, and in other reporting about official Russian troll efforts, one instruction that these sources claimed they received when they worked in a Russian troll house was that they should be as vulgar and abrasive as possible, so that the information space just becomes unpleasant. So people just I think this sort of just demoralizes people's attempts at getting a handle on what's going on. They want you to just give up in understanding the world. And if that is indeed the strategy, I think it's extremely clever, because that's the one type of information space in which a hyper centralized authority structure like the Kremlin outperforms its more decentralized rivals in the West. Number 9, gaslighting. By the way, when I wrote this in 2016, I knew there was a word for like deliberately, doing false things to confuse somebody and drive them crazy, but I couldn't remember it. And I knew there was some classic movie that defined it, and I had to do a lot of creative searching before I found the term gaslighting. I am very sorry to say that politics here in America and elsewhere have devolved to the point of view where now everybody knows exactly what gaslighting is. But anyway, it has always been a big part of the Russian strategy and a big part of what they do. Here is Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, assuming the mantle of victim as if they've been invaded, and discussing how much Russia will be able to forgive. And there on his face is the sarcastic smile. And I should make a whole video about that smile, because it makes appearances in a lot of strange places. Yuri Bezmenov talks about the sarcastic smile of a KGB agent. These are professional, powerful liars, and their expressions betray it. So as we mentioned earlier, Russian doctrine seems to call for bombing civilian targets and then using, quote, perception management efforts, end quote, to take care of that, to, affect it. And it was also explicit in 2014. One of the figures of Russia's invasion, one Pavel Gubarev, he had a pamphlet for Russians who were coming to destabilize Donetsk, and it said, quote, "Don't pass up any opportunity to engage in some atrocity that can be blamed on the junta's fighters." So they call for it explicitly, make atrocities and blame the other side for it. Here are two examples, and there are many others. So there you have it. Those are 9 lessons of Russian propaganda. If you think there are other defining characteristics of Russian propaganda that I should have included as one of the points, I'd be very curious to hear that, so please drop a comment. What I think will happen, I think Ukraine will be victorious. I'm sorry that some of my ancestors couldn't live to see this day. I also think that Russia will go into a very appropriate decline and be forced to rediscover itself. I think Russians will ultimately also be liberated by this war, even though they may not deserve it, given how eagerly many of them are willing to turn a blind eye to genocide, or worse, celebrate it. I also think, sadly, that these lessons will also be learned by the wrong people, and we will see these propaganda tactics employed more and more in the West. But the West has a much sort of healthier foundation for pushing back against it. And in fact, I am debating whether or not I should start a project to build some freedom tech. But if I do, that'd be for another video. Cheers.